Welcome to the Raven Lunatics episode 1. I'm your co-host, Dwight McPherson. I'm a comic book creator, writer, editor, and publisher, and I'm joined by my co-host.
And I'm Chris Sentner, the curator of the Edgar Allan Poe Museum in Richmond, Virginia.
Awesome. Today we are excited to be joined by the international and New York Times bestselling author, Matthew Pearl. My wife and I are huge fans of his work. He has a new book coming out that he'll be talking about, but the book that we're going to be discussing the most today is The Poe Shadow. Matthew.
Thanks for having me, guys.
Awesome.
Thanks for being here.
Thrilled to have you. We are thrilled to have you. The Poe Shadow was amazing, number one, and I know that it got people talking about Poe again, which is wonderful. And what we're going to be discussing today is the death of Poe, as I've already told you, and we're going to be going over 5 topics or 5 possible causes of death. Chris, you want to give us number 1?
Okay, number 1, this is a theory that's been going on for quite a while, even within a few years of Poe's death, that he was a victim of cooping. What exactly is cooping?
Yeah, that's a good place to start. Cooping is the practice of kidnapping someone and forcing them to vote repeatedly for a certain candidate in an election. So this sounds very far-fetched, but it was a real abuse of the system that would happen in the 19th century. And we can trace this to a series of lectures given about Poe in the 1860s. So we're about 10 to 15 years after Poe died is the first time that this theory surfaced as far as the record tells us.
Mm.
Yeah, that was John R. Thompson lectures. He was the editor of the Southern Literary Messenger after Poe left there by a few years, and we've actually got the manuscript for one of his lectures. Weird thing, it wasn't the first theory he came up with. He covered up whatever his first theory was. He glued the pages together of his manuscript.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
That is cool.
So you think this is a plausible theory? We know from the facts he was traveling from Richmond to Baltimore, then from there to Philadelphia. They found him semi-conscious, dressed in somebody else's clothes at a polling place on a voting day.
Right. Right. And I think that's the strongest circumstantial evidence for it, is that it was election day and it was a polling place, among other things. I mean, that's one of the tricky parts of deciphering our narrative here, is that 19th century, it's more likely that one setting has multiple functions. Mm-hmm. Things weren't quite as specialized as they are today, as we're familiar with. Right. So the place that Poe was found was a bar, a hotel, a restaurant, and a polling place on this day. And depending on the narrative we look at, that can lend itself to feeling like it's evidence. So that can't prove that it's cooping, and nothing has ever surfaced that feels to me like it's concrete evidence that cooping occurred to Poe. But I would characterize it as circumstantially plausible.
Now, what are some holes you can blow through that theory?
Well, it's hard to say that cooping would lead to somebody's death, right? So yeah. That's one thing. I'm not sure that anyone has ever pointed to any death that has been attributed, I could be wrong, to cooping as a practice. So even if cooping happened, it's hard to say that gives us our answer. I mean, I personally don't think there is one answer that could explain what happened to Poe, so that's okay. I think one thing that we have to, in my opinion, absorb about Poe's death is there is not. I'm not big into physics, but we're always looking for the unified theory of physics, right? And I think we also do that with Poe's death. We look for one big narrative, one big theory. It feels to me that there is a series of disjointed events and incidents that comprise Poe's death narrative. And so there's no reason that Cooping couldn't be part of it. And another thing we could throw in there in the defense of Cooping is that Poe's famous final word, right, or one of his final exclamations or statements is apparently to call out the name Reynolds. Okay, so there's a couple different theories on what that could mean. One of them is there was a man named Reynolds who was one of the the polling judges at this polling station. So in other words, someone who was in a supervisory capacity for the polling place. So now that's not at the same moment. That's days later in the hospital. So could Poe be thinking he's trying to call out for help from one of these supervisors of the election?
Yeah,
maybe. I mean, it certainly is interesting and almost too convenient that that name fits that narrative. So I think that helps the defense. I think the major hole that we have is, again, there's no reason to think it would cause someone's death. And there's never been, as far as I know, any evidence of a witness or someone to come forward other than this innuendo that it happened to Poe.
Right. That's what I thought as well. Like you were saying, there was many circumstances possibly, and Cooping may just be a part of the puzzle. Like, say, if he had an infection before he arrived in Baltimore, and he was already fevered and, out of his mind, and then to be actually seen as an easy mark by some of these guys and actually pulled into Cooping. But like you said, death by Cooping, that's a stretch. I don't know that could actually. I mean, we know he had a low tolerance to alcohol, as you covered in your book as well.
Yeah, that's certainly my opinion, and I think there is strong evidence for that. I don't know if that's a different topic that we're going to discuss separately, but that a very small amount of alcohol could cause Poe big problems.
Right. Well, that leads right into our next one, doesn't it, Chris? Because one of the possible causes of death is alcoholism.
Yeah. There's rumors that he did go on a drinking binge, so could the alcohol have killed him?
Oh, well, okay, great segue. So, yeah, Poe's relationship to alcohol is very tricky. It's something I studied very closely, and one thing we have to do is we have to put ourselves into the 19th century. So not think about what drinking is today. Even the term alcoholism or alcoholic would not have been a term that we would use back then or understand in the way that we would understand it. So putting ourselves into the shoes of a 19th century individual, first of all, in the South, drinking alcohol was expected of a man, right? So you couldn't, for various reasons, you wouldn't have the opportunities that we have to say, oh, no, thanks, I'll have sparkling water. First of all, water was trickier to drink. There was less access to clean water. There were the social pressures to drink alcohol. And alcohol itself was stronger, much stronger than it is today. So we have on record Poe being very nervous about the social practices and expectations to drink. We have on record contemporaneously, long before he died, hints that Poe could not tolerate alcohol. We have a very specific conclusion that Poe's cousin, Nelson Poe, made about Poe's death, that it had to do with a single indulgence of a drink.
Mm.
Now, Nelson was no friend of Poe's. They had an extremely acrimonious relationship, so this would not be someone who was very likely to make up a story in order to paint Poe in a better light. So what could that mean? Well, from what I could figure out, and from what Poe said himself, one drink could send him into a problematic situation, physically, medically. It could make him seem and be inebriated. Now, is this likely at all? Does this sound far-fetched? It sounds a little crazy. However, we can just think about people we know in our own lives, and we know people have different tolerances of alcohol. We actually know now that medically there are nationalities, ethnicities, subsets of ethnicities that genetically are predisposed to not being able to tolerate alcohol. So with our information that we have today, combining with the realities of the 19th century, it feels pretty persuasive to me, again, especially because the records we have of this could not have been people who were retroactively making up a story in order to protect Poe. Poe was not a cottage industry as he is today of you could write articles and books and adaptations of Poe. He was a relatively unknown compared to many other popular writers of the day writer. So there's no incentive for this to have been an invention. And to me, it feels very plausible that somewhere in this narrative of Poe's death, he drank not necessarily going on a binge. We know that's happened in Poe's life, but we also know at this point that he is very conscious of that he has joined a temperance union. In other words, an organization that is devoted to abstaining from alcohol or drinking very little alcohol. So if there was some circumstance in which he did have a little to drink or felt the pressure to have a little to drink, it makes total sense to me that could have, again, contributed to our multiple narratives that might be colliding here into Poe's death. I don't think there's any evidence that he died from alcoholism in the way that we understand that. That is, that his body was giving out from years of heavy drinking. I'm just not seeing that when I go through the records. And there have been one of the problems with Poe is that we sometimes get over the years a medical professional using 20th or 21st century medical knowledge and trying to apply it in an anachronistic way to the 19th century to say, oh, Poe was an alcoholic, or Poe died of rabies, one of the more ridiculous, in my opinion, theories, just in terms of the actual evidence that was used for it. And these things catch on. They become little blurbs about Poe that get passed on and sort of regurgitated. But alcoholism and drug use are ones that I just did not find enough evidence and in fact found contradictory evidence to feel like that would add up to contributing in a significant way to his death from a medical point of view.
Now, you mentioned rabies. That was one of the more modern theories.
Yeah.
You know about how that came about?
Yeah, I read through the original literature, and I mean, it's not I don't remember the name of the person who came up with the theory, and it's not his fault. I believe it was a man that it caught on. I think he was at and you could correct me, Chris, if I'm remembering this wrong and you happen to know. I think there was a medical conference, and they gave out sort of a paragraph of information about a famous person in history who died, and asked the people at the medical conference to come up with a theory about how they died. And this person got Poe for his. I think that was where the rabies one came from. That was either the rabies one or the carbon dioxide.
Johns Hopkins professor.
It might be.
I think.
Yeah. But when you actually look at the kind of explanation, it's someone who knew very little about Poe, and very little about his death. And I might be merging together, and we might as well put them in the same category, because to me they're in the same category, the rabies and the carbon dioxide poisoning, which was, or carbon monoxide, maybe.
Yeah.
Right, carbon monoxide poisoning, which was another theory that was created in the modern era, that said because of the street lamps, the gas, that he and others could have been poisoned from that. And the rabies was based on Poe having cats, I believe. I don't think there was much more to it. I don't think that there was any record of Poe being bitten by a cat. And okay, so the problem with these theories is that, and again, it's not their fault. They're not literary scholars and they're not literary historians. And I don't mean that in a professional sense. I don't mean that someone has to have a chair in literature at a university. Any of us, and hopefully including me, can make ourselves into Poe historians by being careful and thoroughly studying the literature. But that's not what happened here. So the problem is that without knowing the history of Poe's death, people rely on the information provided by John Moran, who was Poe's doctor when he died. And the initial information from Dr. Moran feels reliable to me. But years later, many years later, Moran goes on the lecture circuit, and for a profit, he lectures about Poe's death once Poe becomes famous.
Right.
And he just completely reinvents the narrative, compared to his own story. In other words, compared to the documents that we have directly and indirectly about Moran's observations of Poe, and before his death and during the time when Poe died. And he just completely reinvents it. So the problem is that doctors or medical historians I think a lot of this was in, for some reason, kind of the 1970s, the 1980s, would look at Moran's information and pick and choose from that what might fit rabies, what might fit carbon monoxide. And they're already working with a corrupted product, which is Moran on the lecture circuit, none of which is verifiable, again, just comparing it to Moran's earlier material.
Right. And theory about the carbon monoxide, a couple different scientists have tested his hair, and one of them was trying to find out if there was any evidence of the coal oil gas in his system. And the evidence would have been a certain uranium isotope. Well, as they found it in his wife's hair, because her hair was a lot longer, she had cut her hair on Valentine's Day, 1846. Since her hair was so long, it represented a few years' growth. And they found that when they were living in New York, they had exposure about the same level as uranium miners. But Poe's hair, which was cut at the time of his death, didn't show detectable levels. And they say that once you've been removed from the environment where you're receiving that exposure, that your system clears up pretty soon. And that seems to refute the carbon monoxide theory.
Yeah, I didn't.
Another professor out at the University of Virginia, Steve Macko, also tested some of the hair for stable isotopes of carbon and nitrogen, and he didn't detect any evidence of the coal oil gas. So it looks like they can finally maybe put the carbon monoxide theory to rest, but we'll probably still hear about the rabies for a while because people just like that so much. There's even an album of Poe readings called Closed on the Count of Rabies.
Yeah, I mean, the problem is, even if we could understand what was going on, if anything, medically with Poe before he is in Baltimore in that final stretch of days, it wouldn't clear up a lot of the mysteries that are there anyway, which is that we have 5 days that we don't know, for the most part, where he is or what he's doing until he surfaces at the hotel, restaurant, bar, polling place, and then in the hospital. And as you said, Chris, we have clothes that don't fit him. We have, as I mentioned, the strange exclamation of Reynolds, Reynolds. So even if we knew what was going on medically, there were other things that were also happening to him, and maybe things that he was doing that we haven't yet sorted out, and maybe we never will sort out.
Right. My problem with the whole rabies thing is that you have a medical student who's making a diagnosis, and as a former Army medic, I was an Army medic for 14 years. The Army tried to give us this algorithm book, right? So we could follow, does the patient have this? And it leads you down a path. But they had to do away with it because they found out that they were misdiagnosing. So, for a medical student to make that assumption, and then for it to be actually put out into the media, that seems to me like more sensationalism, and yet it draws more attention to Poe.
Yeah, which we all like. I mean, I think, on some level, anything that gets people to think about Poe and hopefully to read Poe isn't all bad. Although those of us talking now in this chat obviously prefer to talk about things that we can support with evidence, that that build our knowledge rather than kind of dilute our knowledge of Poe.
Absolutely. And one thing I wanted to talk about, another one, is brain cancer. I actually read an article with you in The Guardian, I believe, where you were talking about the new evidence that had come to light about the possibility of brain cancer. Would you like to discuss that?
Yeah, well, this is a favorite of mine, in part because I always thought it made a fair amount of sense, and in part because while I was researching, I kind of built up a chain of evidence that seemed to me to support it and to add to our information. So basically, I started with I started with a question that a lot of people ask me, which is, why can't we just exhume Poe's body today and use our modern technology and forensics to see if there are clues that can finally tell us this story? Now, again, as we just said, even if we had the exact medical situation and diagnosis of Poe, we'd still have all of these blank spots that we'd have to fill in. But of course, all of us would like to know what Poe's medical status was. It would help us understand Poe as a person, maybe as a writer, and certainly understand Poe's death narrative. So I would always kind of laugh at this question when I would hear it, because it's just not going to happen. His body is not going to be exhumed for many reasons, one of which is the cemetery itself is owned by, what is it, Chris, a law school? Is that who still owns? Yeah. That property in Baltimore. And there's the process that you would have to go through, as I understand it, to get a body exhumed would be, I shouldn't say it's impossible, but it's implausible that it would ever happen. Another issue that people have raised over the years is the fact that Poe's body was moved from one part of the cemetery to another. Now, the reason for that is that when Poe was buried, he didn't even have a marker on his grave. Forget some kind of tomb or mausoleum, just nothing. It was an unmarked grave. And once Poe became appreciated and became popular, there was a group of people led by a female school teacher who raised the funds and raised awareness and moved Poe's coffin from the back of the cemetery to the very front, where it is now, and built a marker for it, or more than a marker. What would we call it? Kind of a
edifice.
Yeah, an edifice. That's a good word. and of course, this is where people leave mementos. Almost any time you go there, at least in my experience, there's flowers. Sometimes people leave alcoholic beverages, which I think is a little bit tacky to whatever extent Poe drank. It certainly was not something he was celebrating in himself, and he realized he had some level of struggle, whether that struggle was an intolerance to the alcohol, or as some people think, that he overindulged in alcohol. I don't know how much he'd appreciate the alcohol, but it's nice to think that, of course, people visit it, they make pilgrimages to it, and they leave sort of mementos for in appreciation of Poe. So one question is, did they move the correct coffin? And was the edifice put in the right place over the coffin? So there's various, not that much, but there's some literature on how coffins move around under the ground in these very, very old cemeteries, and whether we really know where's it. So even if we exhumed Poe's coffin somehow, and I think one of the issues is that edifice can't really be opened or moved in any practical way. Then the question would be, is it really Poe's remains that you'd be looking at? But going back to what I found is that when they opened the ground and they took out Poe's coffin, so assuming that was Poe's coffin, which I haven't seen any evidence that convinced me it wasn't, I had a thought, okay, well, maybe we can't exhume his body today, but what happened when they did exhume it in the 1870s when they moved that coffin? And I wanted to find out, did anybody examine the remains, and is there anything we can learn from that? So I went back to the newspaper archives and to letters and any other descriptions that I could find of Poe's coffin being opened. And what I found is there were a couple very detailed descriptions of his remains, and two of them described his shrunken brain in his skull, and described it in some detail, and how it sounded, when it sort of rattled in his skull, how it looked. And I called up a friend of mine whose wife is a coroner, and I read her these descriptions. Maybe I sent them to her over email, and she said, "Oh, that's not his brain, unless he was embalmed," which he wasn't. He essentially had a pauper's burial with almost nobody at the funeral. Unless he was embalmed, the brain would liquefy and dissolve long before the 1870s. So I said, "Well, what is this object that they're describing?" And she said the most likely candidate, unless somehow someone put a rock or something into the skull, in which case we would think that the observers would be able to tell that it was not organic matter. She said the most likely candidate was that it was a tumor that had calcified and remained there in the skull. So I did a lot of research on that and sort of verified what her thoughts were, and it makes a lot of sense. Someone with a brain tumor could, first of all, exhibit signs that matched up with what Poe was experiencing, as far as I can tell, in those last weeks. Some disorientation, some signs that people mistake for being inebriated, which could fit with our other stories of him seeming like he's drunk, even at a time where he's at least trying not to drink, as far as we can tell. The other thing is that Dr. Moran had said that he died of congestion of the brain. So it also fits with that initial medical analysis that there was a problem with his brain that caused his death. So I'm kind of all in, unless someone presents evidence to the contrary, that Poe probably had a brain tumor. Again, that doesn't explain everything. You could have a brain tumor and get run over by a bus, or you could have a brain tumor and get shot, or something more exotic, right? So it doesn't necessarily explain. It certainly doesn't explain why is he in clothes that don't fit him. Why is he saying Reynolds if he really did say Reynolds over and over again? Why do we not know where he was for 5 days in Baltimore? We still have to piece together those parts of the narrative the best we can, but I think that contributes one piece to the puzzle.
Right. Chris? What do you
Well,
think?
that brings us a little closer. I guess the only other theory we had, if we wanted to really go up to number 5, was about 2 years ago at the last International Poe Conference, a professor from Virginia Tech proposed tubercular meningitis. So tuberculosis that was affecting the central nervous system. And that's another one of those medical issues that we really can't prove or disprove.
Right, right. And someone could have, you know, someone could have multiple illnesses or cancers or, you know, long-standing medical issues or new medical issues. And like you say, there's no way. I find there's no way to really sort out those kinds of ideas. There's nothing wrong with thinking about them, unless we're relying on evidence that we can already discount. As I mentioned, kind of Dr. Moran's later lectures are one example. Other than that, you know, I think anything is fair game, but without evidence, it's kind of just speculation.
So you decided you're going to solve the mystery, and then you created a fictional narrative for the Poe Shadow.
Yeah, well, you know, so the Poe Shadow came out in 2006, and that was my second novel. I'm now on my 6th novel, which is about to come out. And in the last couple of years, I've done more and more nonfiction. It's something I'm kind of leaning into more, is writing narrative nonfiction. But back then, I really was only interested in writing fiction and was writing historical fiction. So this was my way of combining a serious interest in Poe and in Poe's death, and in understanding it better. And I don't know that I set out to solve a mystery, but I had characters who were setting out to solve a mystery, which is maybe more realistic than one of us solving a mystery.
Yeah, and I've been dying to ask you, do you believe the theory that you put forward? Or is that something you would say, I believe that?
Well, so this is what I did for the Poe Shadow, is that I set myself a rule that the main characters were fictional, but that everything dealing with Poe's death and Poe's life, for that matter, was based on historical material. Now, there's historical material about Poe that is more or less reliable. There's historical material about Poe that we have debunked for the most part. And there's historical material about Poe that we simply don't know, that might be true and it might not, just like it would be for any of us. You know, I've taught writing before, and I've taught literature before, and one of the exercises I've done with students is I'll have them write the narrative of their day, that day, you know, from when they woke up and had breakfast to when they get to class. And then I have them tell it to their neighbor, and then have their neighbor write it down. A little bit of a game of telephone, but there's so many pitfalls, even to remembering our own lives, that same day of our own lives. You know, there are people who realize that they wrote down the wrong thing they had for breakfast, or the person they pass along the story to has already accidentally altered their story by the time it gets told to the class. So, you know, it's so hard, even if we're dealing with contemporaneous records. And any of us can attest to that when we read, for instance, a newspaper article about something that we actually know a lot about. Almost always, whether it's about you, if you're somehow in a public circumstance, or simply about something you happen to know a lot about, you will almost always find errors in it. Not necessarily intentional, usually not intentional. So, you know, it's hard. For the novel, I really did try to have everything true to the characters' perspectives as I imagined them, and true to the historical material, without being dogmatic about me being right. I wasn't trying to put myself forward as right, but having characters almost in a debate about what happened to Poe. So yeah, I mean, pretty much everything in the novel I would stand by, even in the voices of the characters. as being grounded in the historical material.
Awesome.
Now you wrote this Poe book after Poe was dead. Have you ever considered doing one from Poe's time with Poe as a character? Maybe solving the Mary Rogers or something?
Well, other novelists have of course tackled Poe as a character, and I don't know if I was writing the Poe Shadow today. Maybe I would do that. Maybe I would think about using Poe as a character, but for a variety of reasons back then, I felt like I wanted to start with Poe's death.
Mm-hmm.
I guess part of it is that I don't feel like we will ever put Poe back together again in kind of a Humpty Dumpty way, in a manner that is true to who he was, and that it's almost more accurate to dramatize and depict our attempts, just as we're doing right now, to understand Poe. That's almost truer to Poe than trying to recreate Poe as a person, because there's so many contradictory elements in his history, because his letters are not as robust, there's not as many as other historical figures, other authors. He didn't leave us a journal that we can really enter his mindscape with. Part of all of that is that when someone like Henry Wadsworth Longfellow passed away, he was one of the most famous, beloved authors in the world. Mm-hmm. So every scrap of paper, every piece of furniture, anything connected with Longfellow was immediately preserved. Mm-hmm. Whereas Poe dying in the circumstance he did, which is such a big part of the death narrative, it's such a big part of this whole idea that this author that we lionize could literally disappear before his death. That's so wrapped up in the fact that he never did achieve that status as a writer in his own time. He achieved some notoriety, some name recognition, but never financial stability, never kind of a consensus of his importance to literature. So everything was just scattered to the wind, and that's why it's so important to have the Poe Museum that you so amazingly supervise and sustain, Chris, and the other Poe related sites that can kind of gather together the bits and pieces that we do have, both archivally and sort of physically. We might have a desk that was Poe's, for example. It's all so precious in trying to understand Poe. So I think for those same reasons, I was trying to create a narrative in which I'm exploring how we do that, how we try to put Poe back together again. And to me, that felt more important and more appropriate than recreating Poe as a person, as a character, and trying to walk in his shoes.
And you also edited the collection of the Dupin mysteries, the Murders in the Remote, Purloined Letter, Mystery of Marie Roget. Sort of inspired you to do that? Or?
I thought it would be a fun companion piece to the Poe Shadow. The thing about the Dupin stories is that, as influential as they are, and without them we probably would not have Sherlock Holmes, at least not in recognizable form, fewer and fewer people read them today. Of course, you read them, and Dwight reads them, but they used to be, I think, pretty widely read, and they've kind of, as Poe's identity as a horror writer has kind of overshadowed almost every other aspect of his writing, and of course Poe was an extremely versatile writer. Some of these stories have kind of faded into the background a little bit. And so I was hoping that that was an opportunity, since I was writing a mystery about Poe, and since I was using the idea of a real Dupont, or Poe's model for Dupont as a character.
Mhm.
I had this idea that it might inspire some readers of my novel to pick up those stories, and it's just a little bit less intimidating to find a volume of those 3 stories. I mean, I have kind of appendices and other material in that edition as well, but it's more inviting, I think, than the complete works of Edgar Allan Poe, or the complete stories of Edgar Allan Poe. That can scare people off sometimes outside of a school setting.
Mhm.
So I was glad to kind of give an opportunity to expose hopefully some new people to those crucial mystery stories that he wrote.
Absolutely. I mean, and isn't that what it's all about? To inspire people to go back to the source material, to read Poe. That's why I write my comics, the Imaginary Voyages of Edgar Allan Poe, to get school-age children interested in Poe. So that's what we do. Those of us who love Poe want other people to know about Poe, and that's why we do what we do. So,
Yeah.
Obviously, we want everybody to go out and get a copy of the Poe Shadow. But
Yeah.
what are you working on right now, Matthew?
Oh, thanks for asking. Yeah, so I mentioned that I've just recently finished a novel. So this comes full circle with my first novel, which was called the Dante Club, and it was a thriller centered around the first American scholars and translators of Dante, who were about to put out the publication of Dante's Inferno when a series of murders break out that are based on the Inferno, and they're the only ones who can kind of unlock that mystery. So this one is called the Dante Chamber, the one that I just finished, and it's a sequel to the Dante Club, in which we catch up with some of the characters from that first novel, mixed in with a whole group of new characters in London this time instead of Boston, where my first novel was set. And it's moving from Dante's Inferno to Dante's Purgatory, which in some ways is an even more fascinating part of the afterlife that Dante conjures up than the Inferno. It's Inferno had some precedents. Other writers and myths had detailed what hell was like, what the torments were like, but Dante really almost single-handedly invented purgatory in this very dramatic way. So this time the characters get caught up in a story in which purgatory itself is being launched or recreated in real life.
That is awesome. And Dante Club is what brought us together as well when I first contacted you. And I actually wrote a comic that's based on Dante's Inferno called Elevator as well. So yeah, I've loved all your books a lot. So I'm really looking forward to. My wife is looking forward to. We have it. It'll be delivered to our house on the day when it drops. So
awesome, thank you.
We're really excited. So where can people find you on the internet if they want to track you down, which they should?
Yeah. Oh well. Thank you, Dwight. And I'm easy to find. My website is just my name, MatthewPearl.com, and I'm on Facebook as I think it's under Matthew Pearl Author to distinguish it from other Matthew Pearls, and on Twitter it's just Matthew Pearl. So I love to hear from readers, and as you say, one of the nicest things I ever hear from readers is that, I read the Dante Club and it made me go read Dante. I read the Poe Shadow and it made me go reread or read Poe for the first time. And as you say, that's part of what it's all about. Is reading is a continuum, and we read one thing, we get excited, and it opens the door to something else.
Absolutely, that's what it's all about, isn't it? Inspiring the next generation, inspiring readers to read.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's part of what Poe is about too. And places like the Poe Museum, people visit it and maybe they just know Poe as a name or an image, a kind of caricature, and once they get a taste for it, on their way out, they might grab a book of a volume of Poe's poems or Poe's stories, and and then that could lead them, that might lead them to Lovecraft, or to back into the 19th century to Longfellow. It's kind of exploring a milieu, a larger community, a larger culture, and that's kind of the most exciting way to discover things. I think, especially when you're young, and Poe was one of those gateway writers for me. He was really one of the first writers that got me excited about reading, not just feeling that I had to read.
Yeah, that's what we hear from teachers all the time. He's the first writer that really gets kids excited about reading, and who knows where to go from there.
Right, exactly.
Absolutely. I just got a picture from one of my readers of The Imaginary Voyages of Edgar Allan Poe, where she's reading a T-shirt that was in my Kickstarter campaign, and she's standing in front of the Poe Museum sign. She's like, I wouldn't have known about this place if it weren't for your book. So to me, I don't take that as I'm like, awesome.
Right.
Find out more about Poe. He was a master, and it's a shame that he was underappreciated in his time. It's awesome to see him in academia, to see him in, school classrooms, to see him everywhere. He's in all pop culture. You see him pop up everywhere, from The Simpsons to, you name it. I think that's awesome because, like we're talking about today with the death of Poe, it just keeps his legend going. I think the mystery of his death, perhaps you'd agree, it perpetuates. It makes people interested in him, just not knowing.
Yeah, I think you're right. Just the fact that it is a mystery, and so maybe we shouldn't try too hard to solve it. It sort of draws people in, and as I've said before, that in some ways Poe's biography starts with his death, not with his birth. His death kind of captures so many themes that draw in his writing, it draw in his ups and downs in his life, and I think make him more of a real person. One thing I worry about a little bit with Poe is that he's easy to caricature, and to kind of make into a cartoon figure of a writer. And when we really drill into those death narratives, and get past the kind of superficial, we see someone who's fighting for his life. He wants to marry a woman that he loves, who he's loved for many years, who he's reunited with. He wants to start a magazine that's finally his, after working for a series of people and struggling in a way that I think his personality kind of made inevitable, struggling with working under someone else's vision. He's very serious about starting his life on a more stable foot at this point, a couple years after losing Virginia, his wife, and all of that kind of contributes to getting to know him as a three-dimensional human being, and not just as kind of this wild, bug-eyed, debauched figure that people fantasize about.
Absolutely. And we want to thank you for doing all you've done to help promote Poe and the Poe Museum.
Well, same to you guys. Both of you, Dwight and Chris, do so much to keep the flame burning. So, I think that's super important. I appreciate you having me here with you.
All right, brother.
Well, thanks for coming.
I appreciate it. Yeah. Thanks. Take care. We look forward to the next book.
Thanks so much, guys. Take care.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Well, special thanks to Matthew Pearl for being on our second show and our first show with an actual guest. So for the two of you that are watching this week, we hope you'll come back next time and tell all your friends.
So that's it. That's our show for this week. And, next Wednesday, we hope you'll join us. And let's just say our topic will be secret for now. How about that? We'll see you then. Thanks for watching. Bye.
Bye.